headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador. I'm Carla Gonzalez, and this is From the South. At 11 p.m. local time on Friday, the United Kingdom is set to finally leave the European Union. Almost 4 years in the making, Brexit has left a path of political turmoil since just over half of the UK's population voted to leave back in 2016, with 2 ousted prime ministers and multiple delays. From Friday on, Prime Minister Boris Johnson faces the task of bringing together a divided nation as those who oppose Brexit continue to express fear of what lies ahead. The UK will now become the first country to leave the 28-member bloc since its creation back in 1993.
But not in a rub it in the Remainers' face type way. I think now it's time to just carry on. Just get on. Let's get everybody back together, bring the country forward, whether you're a Tory, a Labour Party member or whatever. We're all British at the end of the day. Whether you were born here or a naturalised citizen, we just need to get back together, get on with it. Now, it's, what's done is done. We need a bit of unity. And I think all this has done is divide the country. We just need to get back to where we are.
Our correspondent in London, Pablo Navarrete, has more.
Today is a historic day for the United Kingdom as at 11 p.m. local time it will be leaving the European Union. It had joined the European Communities bloc in 1973, and as we know, in June 2016 51.9% of people voted to leave the European Union. Since then there's been a profound political crisis that has meant Theresa May having to leave as Prime Minister and being replaced by Boris Johnson, and Jeremy Corbyn now having to leave his position, the left-wing leader of the Labour Party, leave his position as leader given the catastrophic defeat that Labour suffered in December. Now, many analysts have blamed Labour's decision to support a second referendum as the key driver for that defeat, given that in 2017 Labour came very close to actually winning the election on a mandate that included respecting the referendum result in the most recent election. It had changed its policy and supported a second referendum. Now there are many analysts who worry that the poverty and inequality will increase, with economic uncertainty. Others point to a more stable economic environment where certainty over the issue of Brexit will improve economic growth. It's certainly clear that the divisions will remain. There'll be protests in central London against the decision to leave. Boris Johnson will be showing a pre-recorded interview at 11 p.m. at the same time that Britain is officially leaving. So Brexit is still an open wound, but it's hoped that Britain will be able to transcend the issue moving forward.
That was Pablo Navarrete from London. In other news, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has condemned his Colombian counterpart Iván Duque for rejecting the offer to re-establish consular relations. President Maduro also spoke about the high number of Colombian fugitives that have been captured in Venezuela who cannot be officially extradited.
Today, President Iván Duque declared that he will not open consular relations with Venezuela because there is violence here. But I wonder, where can you actually find violence? In Venezuela or in Colombia? At the request of Interpol, we have captured more than 30 people in Venezuela over the last 2 or 3 years. And Duque doesn't request their extradition because of his ideological extremism. Among those captured, all of whom know Duque is not interested in their extradition, we have Wilfrido de Jesus Torres Gomez, alias Neclocli, leader of the Los Rastrojos paramilitary group. Why doesn't Duque want us to hand over the head of Los Rastrojos? Because this man can reveal many things about Duque's relationship with his criminal gang.
This latest diplomatic clash between Venezuela and Colombia came after the arrest of a Colombian congresswoman in Venezuela. So let's have a closer look.
It seemed like a chapter of Colombia's famed magical realism. President Iván Duque requested the extradition of former Senator Aida Merlano, but he made the request to opposition lawmaker Juan Guaidó, who Colombia had recognized as the interim president of Venezuela. On the run from Colombia and arrested in Venezuela, Merlano is a key figure in a corruption scheme involving supporters of the former Colombian president Álvaro Uribe. For Colombians in Venezuela, it seemed like something out of the imaginary world of Macondo, invented by Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
Recognizing him as president of Venezuela makes it seem that President Duque is playing in Macondo, in an imaginary country with an imaginary president and an imaginary government.
President Nicolas Maduro called on Duque to normalize relations between the two countries, which were suspended after the 23rd of February last year, when Colombia backed an attempt to force so-called humanitarian aid across the border.
Yo estoy dispuesto.
I am willing to restore relations at the consular level with the Colombian government so that all these issues can be carried out through the appropriate channels.
We're asking them to change course now because this is the right time. As we Colombians in Venezuela, we want the consulates to reopen because otherwise we're abandoned by our own country.
In the last 2 years, the Duque government has refused Caracas 11 extradition requests, so Merlano has now become the prize piece in the diplomatic game.
Colombia has flagrantly ignored international law on every occasion in order to maintain its subordination to the United States. And now we see them making the same mistake again, of riding roughshod over international norms.
Colombia sigue albergando estructuras.
Colombia continues to harbor terrorist organizations that have repeatedly tried to stage coups inside Venezuela, and this combines with criminal activity like smuggling, as we saw in the links between the Venezuelan opposition and the Rastrojos paramilitary group. That is what the Duque government does, but that is not a reason for not trying to open negotiations.
Pero no por ello es justamente el impedimento para que se avance en un proceso de negociación.
Colombia and Venezuela share a border of more than 2,000 kilometers and have a long shared history as well. So in spite of the political differences, they have to coexist.
The number of confirmed cases of pneumonia caused by the novel coronavirus in China has risen to 9,720, with 105 registered abroad. The death toll currently stands at 213, while no deaths have been registered outside of China. Reportedly, over 170 patients have been discharged from hospitals after receiving treatment, although health officials warn there is a risk of reinfection until a vaccine is developed.
The Chinese government has paid high attention to the prevention and control measures of pneumonia caused by the new coronavirus. We have already taken the strictest measures. We have the confidence, ability, and effective control system, and we will beat the epidemic. We hope the international community understands and supports China and works along with China on preventing and controlling the epidemic according to international health guidelines to safeguard regional and global public health.
On Thursday, the World Health Organization declared the coronavirus outbreak a public health emergency of international concern. The announcement came at the end of an emergency meeting of the WHO in Geneva. It also followed the first confirmed case of person-to-person transmission outside China in the United States. So far, more than 15 countries have confirmed cases of the illness. Meanwhile, the WHO chief reiterated the organization's confidence in China's ability to contain the virus.
I'm declaring a public health emergency of international concern over the global outbreak of novel coronavirus. The main reason for this declaration is not because of what is happening in China, but because of what is happening in other countries. Our greatest concern is the potential for the virus to spread to countries with weaker health systems and which are ill prepared to deal with it. Let me be clear. This declaration is not a vote of no confidence in China. On the contrary, WHO continues to have a confidence in China's capacity to control the outbreak. I'll repeat this. Let me be clear. This declaration is not a vote of no confidence in China. On the contrary, WHO continues to have confidence in China's capacity to control the outbreak.
And the two new emergency hospitals being built in the city of Wuhan, the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak, should soon be finished. Both hospitals will be fully dedicated to the treatment of patients infected with the virus, with capacity for over 3,000 beds. Coming up, heavy rains and floods continue to affect thousands in Brazil. Don't go away.
Innovation, science, the technological breakthrough and its influence in society.
Viajeros del saber, el futuro está aquí.
Atomen. Monday, only on Telesur.
Welcome back. Ecuador's ombudsman called on the government to stop the persecution of social leaders who led the protests against austerity measures back in October. He demanded that the government of Lenín Moreno recognize that there were severe human rights violations, as 8 people were killed and thousands injured by police across the country.
It's time to stop placing responsibility solely on the Ecuadorian people. The state and the government need to recognize their own responsibilities and determine what they did to control or try to contain the protest, if they actually guaranteed people's rights without excessive use of force. Those violent acts, those acts of looting, are being investigated by the Ombudsman's office. No one can support that, but it's the state's responsibility to answer if they used excessive force, and the country needs to know what the government will do and who is responsible.
Social movements in Colombia are preparing for another strike against the government of Iván Duque and what they call his inability to see that there's a genocide taking place in the country. Hernán Tobar explains why.
International organizations are expressing concern over the worsening humanitarian crisis in Colombia. They referred to the displacement of more than 400 people in the municipality of Tumaco in Nariño, Ñuquí in El Choco, and Taraza in the department of Antioquia. They're also concerned about the increasing number of communities that are under siege by paramilitaries and cannot move, and the continuing murders of social leaders, human rights defenders, and ex-combatants.
What we see in these areas is that when the state is absent or there are complaints of it has been bought out by illegal groups, or when it doesn't act, the communities look to their leaders for their own protection and to fight for their rights. When that happens, those leaders are affecting very powerful interests, and the leaders are threatened and sometimes killed. It is a very sad loss and very painful for their families, but it is also a loss for the country.
This situation affects very particularly the indigenous communities. They are some of those most affected by the violence and the historical neglect of the Colombian government. On Twitter, Senator Feliciano Valencia, an indigenous leader, called it a genocide against indigenous peoples in Colombia.
For 2 years, the Awa, Embera, Guanan, Gunadule, and Eperasapiara peoples have been confined to their own lands. They have been murdered, and children are dying of hunger and other diseases due to this. The government has done nothing and allows the exploitation of gold and timber and allows their extermination.
There's no let-up in the violence in the country, but the government of Ivan Duque is trying to deny it, despite the evidence. It hasn't understood the magnitude of this humanitarian crisis, while before their eyes there is a systematic killing of social leaders, sometimes with the complicity of the state. The government's so-called protection policies have little effect.
We have a government and a state, but mostly a government which is irresponsible in the face of this situation. President Duque does not understand the situation. He doesn't recognize there is a wave of systematic killings, and that there are some representatives of the state who are directly involved, and that paramilitary groups remain active.
These international organizations are calling urgently for the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Prevention of Genocide to investigate this serious situation. At the same time, social movements in the country will meet in Bogota in a large assembly to plan strike action against these murders, the increasing violence, and against the neoliberal measures of President Duque's government. Various social movements are meeting here in Bogota this Thursday and Friday to build a mobilization strategy against the neoliberal measures of President Ivan Duque. They want the president to address the social, economic and political situation in the country, and one of their main concerns is the labor reform being promoted by the education minister.
At least 66 people have died and others are reported missing after heavy rains and flooding hit southeastern Brazil. Streets were flooded and cars swept away in Brazil's third biggest city, Belo Horizonte, by the worst storm on Tuesday night. January has been the wettest month there for over 100 years. The rains have forced more than 80,000 people from their homes in the states of Minas Gerais, Espírito Santo and Rio de Janeiro. Social movements say the flooding has been worse because of the collapse of mining dams in the region in recent years.
After the collapse of the dams in Fundão and Feijão, specialists have studied the river and say these floods are much worse than previous ones. But the data shows this clearly, where with a smaller rise in the level of the river, the waters spread much further into the houses than before. In the floods of 2013, so we are demanding that the justice system acts to hold the Vale mining company responsible for making this flooding worse, and that it pays compensation.
Uruguay's president-elect Luis Lacalle Pou has presented an urgent bill to Parliament weeks before taking office. A bill that has been criticized by progressive parties and social movements.
The incoming government's emergency bill is criticized on a daily basis, as many in Uruguay see it as a move backwards for the many social advances made by the South American nation. In particular, an item regarding public security that was drafted from a highly repressive perspective.
Upon first reading the bill, one can't help but be concerned because their answer to security issues is repression.
Among other things, the bill proposes the protection of all security forces who, during their official activities, wound or kill civilians.
This bill satisfies a number of demands from within the police. It also reinforces the idea that all security forces in Latin America have their hands tied, and this bill unties them. But this is something that was not born out of social demands, but from within the police.
Future opposition sectors have said this law authorizes the easy trigger principle, as police will now act under the idea of shoot first, ask questions later.
This is undemocratic. It's making police into super people who are above the law. It also puts their lives at risk, as gunfire only increases violence. Their message seems to be, police can shoot first and then figure out what the issue was.
Another item in the bill is the imprisonment of those who insult the police. Individual liberties are eliminated and people's rights will be under attack, as this law would also criminalize social protest.
This bill has a very harsh outlook of social mobilizations. The wording is irresponsible and it will only cause tension among the population.
Lacalle Pou's bill is under urgent consideration. Now, the 5 parties that make up his right-wing coalition will study the project and could make modifications to the final draft. It should be approved within 90 days, around the time the incoming president is set to take power.
A court in Nigeria has ordered that the military stop the forced eviction of some 10,000 people living on an island outside of Lagos. Last week, Navy personnel shot in the air and bulldozed houses as they began evicting the community. The military said the operation was aimed at stopping the siphoning of nearby oil pipelines. But residents say they were being punished for the crimes of a small minority and given no notice of the evictions.
How much are they paying to the state?
That's a huge victory for us that we're going back to our community. And we are very happy because our children will be going back to school. That's a very huge success for us. And the other thing we're praying for is that we need a place to stay. The government should try and give us back our home that they demolished because we can't afford money now to build another homes. That's just it.
After this break, more protests against Trump's plans for peace in the Middle East. Stay with us.
A review of the world news that investigates, incites analysis, and induces criticism, because every event has a context.
Pusimos el punto en la I.
Dot in the eye. Saturdays, only on Telesur.
Thank you for joining us again. The Syrian army continues its campaign in the Idlib province as they regain control of the city of Marat al-Munam on Thursday. Marat al-Numan, a former rebel hotspot which turned into a ghost town after months of bombardment, lies on a key highway connecting Damascus to Aleppo. A military spokesperson said the army will continue its work to hunt down all remaining armed terrorist groups until all of Syria has been cleansed of terrorism. In the meantime, government forces backed by Russian personnel have stepped up their campaign to retake control of Idlib, the last rebel stronghold where millions took refuge after fleeing other parts of Syria earlier in the war. The Iraqi police have resorted to using pellet rifles to disperse anti-government protesters. The security forces fired at protesters in central Baghdad as they continue demonstrating against the government. They are demanding that the current political leaders step down, and they are also calling for the United States military to withdraw from their country. The so-called Middle East peace deal proposed by the United States and Israel continues to receive widespread criticism. 2 days after U.S. President Donald Trump delivered the multi-stage plan, protests continue in several parts of the globe, particularly in the Arab world. The main criticism has been that it completely neglects the demands of the Palestinian people to return to their lands by recognizing Israel's illegal settlements.
We reject this deal and will reject any deal or political plan from anyone around the world that diminishes Palestinian rights from our land, from our Jerusalem, from our right to return, our right for resistance, our Palestinian unity, our sovereignty over the land, and our sovereignty in decisions. This is a deal that we completely reject, and we are sure that it will fail. We won't wait for it to fail, but we will make it fail.
A senior advisor to Iran's supreme leader described the deal as a continuation of Crusaders' and Zionists' objectives, pledging Iran's support for the Palestinian people.
This is a plan that consists of selling and dismantling Muslim lands, and whose objective is the realization of the goal of the Crusaders and Zionists. The Islamic Republic will certainly not remain silent. The Iranian people, guided by the supreme leader, continue to consider the Palestinian struggle as the principal concern of the Muslim world.
The United States House of Representatives has approved a bill that restricts the power of U.S. President Donald Trump to launch military actions against Iran. The bill prevents the Department of Defense from providing funds for military action against Iran without the prior approval of Congress. The move comes just weeks after President Trump greenlighted a U.S. drone strike that killed top Iranian General Qasem Soleimani and led to increased regional demands that U.S. forces be withdrawn. And with that, we end our news brief. But you can find all of our stories by checking our website, telesurenglish.net. And you can also join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telesur English, I'm Carla Gonzalez. Thank you for watching.